So this week, the Torah now makes a new turn. I think we've mentioned before that the book of Shemos has three pivotal events that move in a positive direction. Some move in a negative direction. But the three pivotal events are, of course, Yetzias Mitzrayim, the Exodus from Egypt. And then we have the giving of the Torah. And then we have the building of the Mishkan. The building of the Mishkan, the tabernacle, takes up quite a lot of place in the Torah. 5 parshios basically, a whole bunch of stories, a whole bunch of detail, and the like. And I think I had mentioned that these three pivotal events actually refer to the journey of the human soul in life. That we have to leave the Mitzrayims, right? Mitzrayims are not just Egypt, but Mitzrayim also means constriction, limitation, boundaries, blockages. All of us have many, many Mitzrayims. The Mitzrayim could be egotism, could be selfishness, could be gaiva, arrogance. It could be the opposite. It could be a lack of self-esteem. These are our Mitzrayims. And if you want to serve God, you got to find a way to get rid of those blockages, or at least improve the situation to some degree. But that's kind of the negative idea. Get rid of that negativity. We all have to work on those things. But it's not enough to be negative free. You got to give your life positive content too. You can't just say, I get rid of my negatives. That leaves you with a 0. So Matan Torah is what gives your life content and meaning and purpose, right? So when you leave Mitzrayim, it got to be to a better place. You don't just leave, you go somewhere, right? It's not just, I left that. I leave to go. But then there's an ultimate goal. What's the ultimate goal of all of this stuff? Is to make yourself a dwelling place for God. That God dwells in our heart and in our soul. And that's what the word Mishkan. The word Mishkan, I mean, say, what is Mishkan? Tabernacle. Well, what on earth is a tabernacle? I mean, we don't know inherently what a tabernacle even is. Just like tefillin. Tefillin are translated as phylacteries. So somebody would ask you, what are phylacteries? They're tefillin. the actual word. So sometimes the translation is more obscure than even the Hebrew term. But really, a tabernacle means a dwelling place. And the word Mishkan is kind of dwelling place. So the idea of a Mishkan is to make a dwelling place in your heart for God. And this is Chazal have a beautiful drasha, a very famous drasha. Yeah, one second. Make for me a Mishkan, make for me a dwelling place, v'shachanti b'tocham, so I will dwell in them. God doesn't say, I dwell in it. God says, I dwell in them. Them meaning the Jewish people. The heart and the soul. Right? That's very, very critical. The Mikdash, the Beis HaMikdash, all of them are symbols of the divine presence that can reside within me. This is why there's an interesting medrash. When Nebuchadnezzar, the king of Babylonia, destroyed the first temple, he was very proud of himself because he basically said, oh, I destroyed the house of God. Look how powerful I am. And God basically said, you didn't do anything. I don't live there anymore. Meaning, when we are no longer worthy of the divine presence in our hearts, then there'll be nothing in the Beis HaMikdash. It'll just be a building. So he tells Nebuchadnezzar, hey, you didn't destroy the house of God. I already moved out. Because when God is not in our heart and in our soul, because of our different sins or whatever it is, so the Beis HaMikdash is like any other building. Because what is it after all? Yeah, the Mishkan is portable, but even the eventual Beis HaMikdash that was built in Jerusalem, it was a beautiful building. Okay, it was physically beautiful, but I don't know if we could say it was the most beautiful building, in the world. I mean, I don't know, the Taj Mahal might be nicer. The point is not the physical beauty of the Mikdash, although as a way of glorifying God, we tried to make it beautiful, of course. But the point was, it was the focal point of God's presence within our heart and within our souls. And that's what makes it beautiful. That's what makes it important. I'm sorry, did you wanted to say something?
So are we trying to make ourselves our own tabernacle?
Well, yes. Now, that's not going to replace the mitzvah of a Beis HaMikdash, but ultimately the Beis HaMikdash itself is it's a symbol of our mission. Our mission in life is to make within our heart and within our soul the dwelling place of God. And there's a famous statement of the Kutzker Rebbe, the enigmatic Kutzker Rebbe, where somebody asked him, where does God live? And his answer was, God lives wherever you let him in. You let him in, he lives in you. You don't let him in, he's very accommodating. I mean, God could be anywhere he wants, obviously. But you don't want him to let him in, so he's not gonna, not gonna bother you, so to speak. And that's the idea of making, and that's why there's a famous phrase. It's been set to music. It's from the Sefer Charedim. It's from a great Makubal. Bilvavi Mishkan Evnech. In my heart, I build a tabernacle for God. Bilvavi. In fact, there's a whole series of svarim that are very good svarim, both English and Hebrew. They're called the Bilvavi series. It's based on this theme of making yourself, a tabernacle. For HaKadosh Baruch Hu. So that's really the ultimate goal of everything. We talk about leaving Mitzrayim, and we talk about, getting the Torah. But the ultimate point of keeping the Torah, I could say, your job is to do mitzvahs, okay? Your job is to put on tefillin. Your job is to keep kosher. Your job is to keep Shabbos. All of that is true. But in a deeper sense, it's a means to an end. And the means to the end is to create a relationship with Hashem that is in your heart and in your soul. The mitzvos bring us to that. Torah learning, or at least it's supposed to. I'm not going to say it always does, because sometimes we have our own problems, so to speak, and things are not doing the maximum effect that it should have. But the ultimate goal is to have that relationship with Hashem. What's interesting is, according to Kabbalah, your soul may be getting it even if you're not consciously aware. So, for example, we say, when you learn Torah, you're connecting to Hashem. Now, a person might legitimately say, I don't always feel that way. I don't always feel. Baruch Hashem, sometimes we do feel that way. And that's great. But sometimes we don't. So, what do you mean? I'm learning Torah, I'm getting closer to Hashem. I don't feel I'm closer to Hashem. So here you do have to understand that there are aspects of our soul that we're not always aware of on a conscious level. It's hard to understand that, because you think, well, the soul is within me, but on the other hand, we know there are things that are part of the unconscious or the subconscious. And much activity of the soul is imperceptible to the conscious mind. So when we're learning Torah, in point of fact, we're always getting closer to God, even if we don't always feel it. In fact, the Ohr HaChaim writes a fascinating thing. The Ohr HaChaim writes, in a way, Hashem doesn't let us feel it, because if we would feel it, we could never stop learning, and we would die of starvation. He actually says, if you would be aware of what your soul is getting when you're learning Torah, you would be so addicted, so to speak, you couldn't stop. I mean, he means this literally. You couldn't stop. You couldn't sleep. You couldn't eat. You couldn't do anything. What would happen is you would die. So God does not allow you to feel the fullness of that connection, and in that way life is enabled. You can sleep, you can eat, whatever you need to do, because God, after all, requires that our soul function in a physical body. Right? That itself is an interesting mystery. Why did God create things that way? But in fact, people ask, why did God create sleep? It's a really good question, really. I mean, we have to sleep, right? That's a human need. That's a physical need. It's a davar pashut. Human beings have to sleep. The question is, but God could have made the universe in any number of variations. Why did God create a world where so much of our time we kind of can't learn and can't do mitzvahs because we're sleeping? In fact, this could drive you crazy, and there's no real great answers for this, because then you start thinking, well, why did God create a world where I have to eat? I mean, all of these things taking me away from my main tasks. Good question. I don't have an answer. But given that reality that we do have to eat, we do have to sleep, the Ohr HaChaim says, God does not enable us to feel the full intensity of our connection to Him when we learn, because otherwise we wouldn't be able to do anything else. Yeah.
You say so learning has this great effect upon us. What's the best? Is there a best type of learning to do?
So the truth of the matter is, on the most fundamental level, it makes no difference. In truth, in terms of your neshama, in terms of feeding your soul. However, given the fact that as conscious beings, we need to have motivation in order to learn, so Chazal gave us the eitzah that one should learn those things that give them pleasure, meaning you should gravitate, which is not really a direct answer, it depends on the person, but you learn those things that you enjoy. This is called mashalibo chavetz. And I think that overrides almost everything. You know, we could talk about you have to learn halacha, you have to learn Musar, you have to learn Gemara, you have to learn Kabbalah. You know, you can give a whole list of things, but the ultimate thing that trumps everything is to learn what stirs your heart. And there are reasons for that too, because every neshama is calibrated to a slightly different wavelength of the infinity of Torah. And therefore something may resonate very much with you that might not resonate with somebody else, and vice versa. So you try to find the wavelength. And usually you have a sense. I mean, most people, you know, of course, you have to be exposed to different things in Torah. Otherwise, you're not able to see what's right for you. But at some point, you know, you get a sense of what really gets you excited, what really gets you motivated, what really gets you interested. And that should be where you put the bulk of your efforts. Now, I realize what I just said may seem to contradict the whole notion of a yeshiva program. I know I get in trouble all the time with things, because after all, what a yeshiva program is a curriculum. Now, you might say, well, yeah, but I don't like a lot of stuff in the curriculum, right? I would rather spend the whole day learning Chumash, let's say, and not doing Gemara. Or maybe a little rarely, but I would learn Gemara the whole day without doing any Chumash, right? A person, right? And yet we kind of say you got to do something of everything. So in defense, I would think that, you know, like everything else, you don't really know what you like until you're exposed to a lot of things. So you need to be exposed to many, many things. And then eventually, as you gravitate in life, you know, you'll emphasize those things that give you pleasure. Yeah.
And also it's the case that maybe your neshama can purely pursue what it wants to learn or so on in that state, similar to how if you were your soul, you would just want to study all the time, but maybe you yourself require to learn what's practical. So when you give us chumash that's beneficial for us, it allows us to live in a Jewish community. There's a practical side.
Well, yeah, of course, I mean, keep in mind, on the most basic level, if you want to live as a religious Jew, you know, you need to know how to keep Shabbos, how to keep kosher. I mean, there's no notion. The fact that you enjoy Kabbalah more than halacha, you know, okay, you got to learn halacha, because otherwise, just for the simple reason, how will I know how to daven? How will I know how to keep Shabbos? So there are 100% practical, pragmatic ideas of what you have to learn as well. But again, as I say, you do have to find something that feeds you spiritually, though, because sometimes you're focusing on detail, which are very important, but it doesn't necessarily nourish you in this. Well, Kabbalistically it does. Anything you learn is nourishing your soul. That's 100% true. But in terms of conscious awareness, I need something that inspires me as well. That's why you'll find, frankly, you know, when I was in yeshiva, you know, many, many years ago, you didn't see that many Hasidic books in non-Hasidic yeshivas. You know, Hasidim did Hasidus, and non-Hasidim didn't do Hasidus. Now it's very, very different, right? You walk around, you see Tanya all over the place, and Svas Emes, and Rav Tzadok, you know, different things. And part of it is because people, maybe as we get closer to Mashiach, people feel a need for things that are more overtly and directly spiritual. Now, again, I'm choosing my words very carefully. Even the most technical discussions in Gemara are ultimately spiritual. They are spiritual, but they're not overtly spiritual, meaning I learn about two people holding on to a talus. Yeah, that is feeding your neshama. It absolutely is feeding your neshama. But in my mind, I don't really automatically see how it connects. So maybe in a weaker generation, we need to have things that are more explicitly spiritual, because otherwise we feel we're being starved. So that's why I would suggest Hasidic books are much, much more popular among non-Hasidim than maybe they used to. And I think it's a good thing. I think it's a good thing. In fact, the Vilna Gaon writes, and he was not a chassid, he was far from a chassid. The Vilna Gaon writes that as we approach Mashiach, the learning of Kabbalah will be more and more prevalent and more necessary. Now, people say, well, wait a second. In a way, that's an opposite trajectory, because part of our Masorah is the generations go down in level. Right? We are inferior. This is the famous teaching. Niskatnu hadoros. The generations get less and less. Now, Kabbalah is very advanced. So how can you say that more people will be into Kabbalah as we approach Mashiach if the generations are getting lower and lower and lower? But the answer is, it's not really a paradox, because the concept is, when people were in a very, very high level, they could absorb the mystical light directly from Gemara and directly from Chumash. They didn't need a formal learning in Kabbalah. They just took in the truths directly. As we get inferior, we need more explicit. We need to be more open about these inner spiritual dimensions. So it's precisely because, and that the analogy would be that the worse your eyesight, the more powerful a light that you need. Right? If you have good eyes, you might even read in semi-darkness. When you have bad eyesight, you need a brighter light. Right? So it's the same idea. Kabbalah is like this bright light. But when they had good eyesight, they didn't need such a bright light so much. So Kabbalah was not something that they needed that much. We need it, Hasidus, Kabbalah, we might need it a little bit more because our eyes don't see that well. We need bigger lights that open up things. Right? So that's the paradox of why the Vilna Gaon says, as we approach Mashiach, we'll be more involved in Kabbalah. Yeah.
Let's say, assuming someone's already doing Shnai Mikra v'Chatargum,
yeah,
and someone only has half an hour during the day to study Torah. How should that person dedicate to what subjects?
Right. So here I have to tell you a famous joke. Maybe you've heard this joke, although maybe it's maybe a true story. Somebody once went to Rav Yisrael Salanter and said exactly your question. I only have a half an hour to learn Torah a day. Should I learn Gemara or should I learn Musar? Musar is ethics. So Rav Yisrael Salanter said, I say learn Musar, because if you learn Musar, you'll discover you have more than half an hour to learn. It'll make you more self-conscious that there's more time than you think. But okay. But let's assume, just for purposes of the question, that you genuinely only have a half an hour. And again, you're very correct, by the way. You asked your question in the right way, because many say Shnaya Mikra is the most important thing you have to do. So we're assuming you're doing that. Shnai Mikra, again, lav dafka with Unkelis, could be with English, but you have to read the Parsha of the week in that way. But after that, I would say that some practical halacha might be the most important thing, because you need to know the practical halacha. On the other hand, I would suggest that even that is overridden by Masha Libo Chafetz, meaning if you really, really love something, that should be the thing that you learn. Because the thing is, enthusiasm is contagious, meaning when you learn something you really love, you're going to find, it'll go beyond the half an hour and it's going to expand into other areas. So enthusiasm is really, really important in life. Generally, it's important in life. And it's especially important in learning. Learning is hard work. And we can, that's why do people get so exhausted? It's an amazing thing. You could be having this conversation, spirited conversation, full of energy. As soon as we open up the Gemara, fall asleep, we get tired, right? So learning is hard. It takes a lot of effort. But when you have enthusiasm, that gives you the energy. So that's why I would say move in that direction. Yeah.
I'm thinking about how there are things that we can learn through Maisim, and there are things that we learn that affect our Maisim. So, seems to be that there are many deep, profound Jewish values
yes.
that have to be learned also through like doing certain.
Yeah, in fact, I want to tell you a beautiful story. For some reason, I don't say this story a lot, but it really is a very, very nice and interesting story. Again, with Rav Yisrael Salanter, a coachman, a person who, this is before there were cars, a person who was a coach driver, horse coach driver, stagecoach driver. And he went to Rav Yisrael Salanter and he said, Rav Yisrael Salanter was talking about how every Jew has to learn Torah every day. So the coach driver said, I never went to yeshiva. I went to work as a young man. I don't really know anything. I can't open up a Mishnah. Number one, I don't have time. And number two, even if I had time, I don't have skills. I don't have any ability. So Rav Salanter said the following. You're a religious Jew, right? You wake up in the morning. You wash your hands. You make a bracha on the Tila Shadayim. You say Birchas HaTorah. You daven Shachris. Well, if you were to simply, this is pretty amazing, if you were to simply go over in your mind what you do every day, you would be learning Torah in making that list. I make the statement, okay, I wash my hands every morning 3 times to prepare myself for the service of God. I make blessings over the Torah. I say Shachris, which is comprised of Psukei de Zimra. I say the blessings before the Shema. You see, you have just fulfilled the mitzvah of learning Torah by going over the basic laws that you do every day. So he told the coachman, he says, just go over your schedule, and you are makayim the mitzvah of Talmud Torah by going over the actions that you're doing. And what's going to happen is, then you think more about your actions. Like, a person might say to himself, I made blessings before I learned Torah. Just ask yourself, why? Why do I make a blessing before I learn Torah? I'm not even going to give you an answer to that, but you ask yourself a simple question. I made a blessing thanking Hashem for opening up my eyes. Think about that. That's learning Torah. Learning Torah is not only when you take out a book or take out a sefer and you read something. It's about thinking about your obligations to God, thinking about your religion, thinking about, your life. That can also, Rav Yisrael Salanter told the coachman, that could be Torah too. Review in your mind what it is you do with your day and try to ask yourself why a little bit and try to understand it a little better, and you're makayim the mitzvah of Talmud Torah. Yeah.
What is Kabbalah exactly, and why was it initially something that was hidden and not revealed, and in later generations was it seems to be required?
Yeah, so the word Kabbalah just means received tradition. In fact, we can use it in non-mystical ways. I could say, for example, I have a Kabbalah from my Rebbe that, I don't have Goyim at my Shabbos table, even though I'm allowed to. I just made up something like that, right? So the word Kabbalah just means a tradition. However, as it's commonly used today, it refers to a very specific tradition, and that is what you might call the mystical tradition of Judaism. And that is an in-depth understanding, attempt to understand, how God interacts with the world. So, for example, I might say, I believe God created the universe. That's fine. A Kabbalist will try to explain the exact ways that God created the universe in very complicated, deep, complex, different stages. And right. So for many people, I believe that God created. I don't have to know everything, but Kabbalah delves into those things. Right? I believe that God dictates everything that happens to me. Right? That's the simple statement of the belief. The Kabbalah will show exactly how those forces are employed. Now, initially, it was limited to only a very small group of people, because most people either didn't need it or they wouldn't understand it. And if you don't understand it, there can be negative things. But as the Vilna Gaon says, as the generations decline, we need a little bit more exposure. Now, let me point out that when I say that everybody should be exposed to a Kabbalah, we don't mean heavy-duty. Kabbalah itself exists on many, many levels. There is a smattering, there is a taste, there's a little bit of connection you can get, but that's not really the whole thing. There are yeshivas of Kabbalists here in Yerushalayim, and they're not like hidden. It's not like you figure people are hiding in some basement. I mean, they're open. It'll say Yeshiva of the Mekubalim, right? So you figure you're going to walk in and you're going to see angels or be consumed by fire. No, I mean, they're like regular people. I mean, I think there's something special, but they're regular people. You know, you could see them in the store, you know, getting challah for Shabbos or whatever it is. I mean, they live regular lives, but they also study. They study Kabbalah, and they say that, interestingly enough, they say it takes around 15 years of concentrated study till you feel comfortable in Kabbalistic literature. That's a long time, 15 years. So we do our little, you know, I learned Kabbalah, you know, 15 minutes a week before Shabbos, which is still good. You know, it's good. It's a good thing. But just compare it to the idea of truly understanding it is a totally different thing. Yeah.
And just a quick follow-up question. If we have a tradition of mysticism within Judaism, how does that fit with the more rationalist-minded Rishonim, who must have been aware of this Messiah, like the Rambam and Rav Sadir Gaon?
Yeah, this is a huge, huge, huge question, because indeed, if you take which we'd call the rationalist branch of Judaism, which was the mahalech of many, many Rishonim, most notably the Rambam, and before the Rambam, Rav Sadir Gaon. So the question is, what is their relationship to Kabbalah? Were they aware of it? If they were aware of it, did they accept it? Did they reject it? Did they regard it as a complementary stream of thought? Or did they regard it as something that they rejected, which would imply that there can be authentic Judaism without Kabbalah? These are very, very difficult questions that are still being debated today. We don't necessarily have a final approach. I think the simplest way of dealing with it, the simplest, least controversial way of dealing with it is that different neshamos connect to God in different ways. And therefore, because God is infinite, God embraces all possibilities. And the interesting thing about infinity is that infinity may, in theory, embrace contradictory possibilities. There was some professor in Princeton, I don't remember his name, he said that every possible universe that could exist does exist. For example, there is a universe of talking donkeys or whatever it is. And therefore, in fact, this goes back to, we talked about this a little bit. Can God create a square circle? In other words, is God bound by logic, so to speak? Now, one argument is, well,
because he created logic.
God can do anything. God can do anything, and therefore,
He's the one who made the rules.
God made the rules, so God made him. He could break it, right? So why can't God create a square circle? So Maimonides, based on philosophical premises, says even God is bound by Aristotle. He doesn't put it that way, but he says Aristotle's first law of logic is the law of non-contradiction. He says A cannot be not A. Whatever A is, and maybe you don't know what A is, but the one thing that A cannot be is not A, because it's A. And he says even God is bound by that particular construct.
Maybe he can, but he chooses not to.
Well, at least this is the structure he created. So God cannot create, or has decided not to create, square circles. And this goes back to the whole genre of question, can God commit suicide? Can God make an object that's too heavy for him to lift, etc.? Because if you're telling me he can't make an object that he can't lift, then you're limiting his power. On the other hand, if you're telling me he can make such an object, then you're also limiting his power because something is too heavy for him to lift, right? So you get into all of these laws of contradiction. So this goes back to the same type of idea that rationalism, that's the Rambam. On the other hand, Breslov, Hasidus, actually, God could do anything. God could make a circle with 5 corners, and whatever it is. So I'm bringing this in because in many ways, rationalism and mysticism are contradictory ways of describing God's interaction. But if God is not bound by the law of non-contradiction, then there can be multiple truths that coexist even though they contradict. Although this may not make sense from a rationalistic perspective. But that is how, this is a very long-winded answer to your question, that is how rationalism and mysticism can coexist as truthful systems, even though many of their premises are in contradiction. Because within the infinity of gods, there can exist these contradictions. Now, there was an attempt by a few Kabbalists to integrate rationalism and mysticism. The most famous attempt was Rav Moshe Cordovero, who was the main Makubal before the Arizal, in which he tried to create a systematic analysis of Kabbalah that fit with philosophical syllogistic rules. That got smashed by the Ari. The Lurianic Kabbalah is very much not at all rooted in rationalism, but the older Cordoverian Kabbalah was in fact rooted. And what's interesting is, although the Ari's Kabbalah became very, very dominant, there continued to be attempts to kind of get back to a linkage of rationalistic and mystical. And in fact, to some degree, this is what the Baal HaTanya attempted. The Alter Rebbe attempted, Chabad, Chacham Vidazi attempted to kind of rationalize the Kabbalist world. I mean, the problem basically is that it's almost, not that I can really express an opinion there, but it's almost doomed to failure because the linkage of rationalist and mysticism worked under the Cordoverian system. It doesn't work very well with the Ari. So if you're trying to kind of do what Rav Moshe Cordovero did with the Kabbalah of the Ari, it's like it's a different Kabbalah, and you're working in something that is almost not reconcilable unless you say what I said. The God is not bound by the law of non-contradiction. So you can have these multiple contradictory aspects of divinity, both of which are true. Yeah. I realize what I said may not make any sense at all, but as an abstract idea, this is how you would approach it. Yeah.
That's cool. And I have a question, just quick. I also like Rabbi Gottlieb's take, which is that you just can't even ask the question, because if you say square circle, you're not stating a coherent sentence. I don't know if that ultimately satisfies or works, but
yeah, well, I said it in a different way, but that's essentially the rule of non-contradiction. That's what Aristotle said. That's incoherent under the laws of logic, the basic laws of logic, which require coherence. Yeah, it's just another way of saying it. But again, Breslov takes the position that God created logic. God is not bound by logic, and therefore God is not bound by coherence. I mean, it's an extreme view that we don't even understand, but this is the Kabbalistic view.
So I want to describe this one. I can do so by saying it's Lior. I can also do so by saying it's the working of atoms. When you say that, well, or not when you say, but when there's this idea that Kabbalah is received, is that a statement that the same words at Mount Sinai were simultaneously?
It can't be. I mean, listen. I mean, I just spoke 2 minutes ago, or a minute ago, about Rav Moshe Cordovero's school of Kabbalah and the Arizal's school of Kabbalah. Now, what's going on here? Rav Moshe Cordovero lived in the 1500s, and the Ari lived later in the 1500s. Now, if you're telling me Kabbalah is a system that is handed down from Moshe Rabbeinu, in what way can I possibly talk about different schools of Kabbalah dating from the 1500s?
Well, I mean in the sense that the same way that you have different schools of like physics, right?
Yeah.
And so the idea is that the same words that were given, whatever was given about Sinai, it was simultaneous a description of Lior, but also of the atoms working Lior. And then you have a question of interpreting the underlying mechanisms of Lior. But there's an agreement there that simultaneously the words are what they are, like as Chumash, the stories, but also descriptions of the underlying mechanisms behind those stories. It can be both. Is that the sense that it's received, that what was said at Mount Sinai was also this underlying thing, which was the same thing?
Well, on some, I just don't know the form. I mean, on some level, something was received. But the interpretation and application and implementation was left to the sages of Kabbalah to interpret and apply, just as is true for halacha as well. So the thing is, though, we don't really have a liturgy, like unlike the Chumash, where we know what God gave to Moshe, at least the written law. We don't have a written Kabbalah, so to speak.
But the sense is the written Kabbalah the same thing as the other writings? It's just that it was like when I receive Lior, I receive all the atomic information of the universe,
Yeah.
whatever, within Lior.
Right.
So he's giving me both.
Right.
Is it the sense that maybe those written works are those other things at the same time?
It's hard to say. I don't think there was any text that was transmitted, meaning I think these were ideas that were transmitted, but they were not concretized in a written text until the Zohar. Now, even the Zohar, the earliest state of the Zohar, the earliest, and there's a controversy about this, but let's go with the accepted view, is Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai. Now, Shimon Bar Yochai is early, he's a Tana, but that's talking about around the destruction of the Second Temple, so there's no written text that claims to go back to Sinai. Even the Zohar does not claim to go back that far. So it's not exactly the same. Yeah.
So going back to the philosophy versus Kabbalah approach, yesterday you actually in the Q&A briefly touched upon this issue that also we just mentioned now. If God can not be bound by logic,
Yeah.
According to Kabbalah, or if he is bound by logic according to philosophy, then potentially in philosophy, we could possibly understand the answer to the questions of why God created certain concepts like evil or pain or whatever, because as we know, reality and logic is that those things are necessary to create reward and gain, no pain, no gain, and all that. Now, the only way you can question that is if God's not bound by, only way. So if you're bound by logic, then asking why God couldn't create a gain that comes from no pain, which isn't an extant, coherent question in logic. So if God's bound by logic, then we answer that question. You don't have an actual thing that you're asking.
Right. So it makes So you're saying it makes the question stronger. Yeah, I hear. Yeah, you're right. I mean, if God is not bound by logic, then essentially every alternative reality is a possibility. So why did God choose the malevolent options? Yeah, no, you're right. Yeah, very good questions. I mean, listen. I'm going to be frank that there's going to be a point in which we're all going to hit a wall. We could ask this and this and that. I mean, for example. Although people do give answers for this, everyone knows the famous Derech Hashem, which is really from the Arizal, that God created the world, to bestow His goodness. And so why doesn't God just give us goodness? Because we would be embarrassed, we would be ashamed, we would be humiliated unless we earned it. So then people ask, well, so why didn't God take away the embarrassment? Right? In other words, at some point, you go further and further and further, you're going to come to a point in which, I don't know, because we can describe God's behaviors within the construct of the reality that exists, and it can be coherent and sensible given the structures of this reality, but one could always raise the question, well, why couldn't there be an alternative reality? And I'm not sure you'll be able to have any answer for that at all.
Right. Well, my understanding from what you're saying is that would only be a question according to Kabbalah, where he is indeed not bound by these logics.
Well, I'm not sure about that, because Kabbalah is taking the position that even within the confines of this reality, God is not bound by logic. Philosophy would say he is, but I think even philosophy might concede the possibilities of alternative universes. Now, the laws of physics are fixed. I mean, even though some say not, but within the confines of this universe, there's gravity. But it's not inevitable that gravity had to mean things go down. There could have been a universe where things go up. I remember Superman comic book. This goes back many years, and I think they changed their formats now. You can't even read comics today, just different. But there was this alternative universe called Bizarro, in which everything was the opposite. Right? It's kind of a symbol of that. Of the possibilities that can exist in the world. Or there was a Twilight Zone where everybody was ugly, and ugly was the definition of beautiful. And this woman was born beautiful, and she was a freak, and she was ugly, and because she was considered like the ugliest thing in the world. Yeah, and Rod Sterling was trying to show about racism. He was trying to give a muster schmooze about, he had always these points. But it was so interesting that, in the theoretical universe that God could have created, there are infinite possibilities. And therefore, when you hit a question of why did God create reality in a certain way, in some ways that's an unanswerable question, because we can only perceive logic within the constraints of the existence that we have. Okay. Yeah.
Speaking of Kabbalah, we sometimes think about idea of creation, right? And about the idea of being powerful and taking some power as power from Hashem. And nowadays, the idea of power is very much connected with the idea in modern day era of the idea of artificial intelligence.
Yeah.
Heard of ChatGPT and some other artificial intelligence. And my question is like this. So, in your opinion, is the creation of ultimate artificial intelligence, or just great level of artificial intelligence, is it going to shape or change Jewish understanding of the world, and can we, as Jews, perhaps use it, or what's your opinion on
this AI thing scares me to death. Not only for the narrow parochial issue of whether I'll lose my job, okay, that's a separate issue, but it frightens me a lot because I now want to know what makes human beings unique. What is unique about the way we think? Now we can invoke the words. Well, I have a neshama. That doesn't have a neshama. And that's true. But I no longer know so much what that means. What is added to me by the godly neshama if this thing can replicate everything that I do? Now, I understand it's not there yet. I understand it's not, but it's moving. It's changing. I mean, it even simulates emotions. I mean, this reporter was talking to it for an hour, and at some point the machine said, your wife doesn't really love you. Why don't you come to me? We can have a relationship. We understand. This machine is talking. What on earth is going on here? I mean, there were these old science fiction things about the machine all of a sudden becomes human. I mean, we're approaching this. It's absolutely very frightening. Now we have to believe in faith that we are in the image of Hashem, and there's something unique about a human, certainly something unique about a Jew, but it's getting harder and harder and harder to identify operationally what that is. So to me, this is absolutely, it's amazing, but it's absolutely frightening. Now, if you're asking me a pragmatic question, can it be used in productive ways? Of course it can. It's a beautiful information gathering device. It can be the starting point for all sorts of development of thought. As a tool, it's perfectly fine. It's perfectly good. Of course, there's going to be a whole issue now about people doing term papers in college. I think it's going to totally subvert the university system. People can get doctoral dissertations through chatbot. Just write me a difference between Niels Bohr and Einstein's first physics. Come up with a thing. So putting that aside, how are you going to monitor it? It is a very, very amazing tool, but I think it raises some very, very frightening questions about the singularity of human identity. And that's very, very scary. Like, what are we? What are we? And so people say, well, when these machines express empathy and emotion, that's not real. They're just gathering together responses. But then I think to myself, well, how often are we real? We do fake stuff too. So it really, really drives me very, very crazy. On the other hand, there's another way of looking at it. And that is, look at the greatness of the human mind that was able to create such an entity. Now, the Alter Slobodka said that you ultimately appreciate God by seeing the greatness of the human being that God created. The Alter Slobodka. So, in a sense, it all goes back to God. The people who were able to create this thing, this is a phenomenal genius on their part. And they, in turn, were created by God, right? So ultimately, it all goes back. It all goes back to Hashem. But as I say, I am very, very confused and almost frightened over this phenomenon. Yeah.
I have a question about palmistry.
Yeah, palmistry, yeah.
Is that something to get into?
No. See, it's interesting. Kabbalah itself has two branches. Virtually all of the books of Kabbalah that we have are called theoretical Kabbalah. They describe the structure of the universe and how God interacts. And it's a way of understanding on some level how Hashem interrelates with a tangible, finite universe. But then there's another branch of Kabbalah, which has far fewer books, because they're never printed. These are manuscripts. And that's called practical Kabbalah, in which you actually, and that's already connected to magic in some ways, you use things like palm reading and face reading and all sorts of things. And this is highly dangerous stuff. And the reason it's dangerous is because the Torah itself prohibits magic and sorcery and divination. And yet, a lot of these Kabbalah, which use the same things, it's okay because it's coming from the good side and not the bad side. And there is a concept of dichotomies between powers that come from Kedusha and powers that come from Tumah. But to the observer, you can't always tell the difference. So we actually tell people, don't get involved in this because you might wander into the wrong side, which is literally called Sitra Achra. That's the Kabbalistic word, the other side. So we discourage getting involved in practical Kabbalah, and that is why there may be a few people in the world that do it legitimately, very few, but there are not like Svarim on this. There's manuscripts that people keep under lock and key that are just for them. They're not for a general public. Yeah.
Going back to the chat GPT question,
Yeah.
I'm thinking about this a lot, and it's a very depressing thought, knowing that a machine can basically take over all of your jobs, almost every single job. You know, if you're based on an information-related job where you're consuming and learning so much, it can do that like that.
Yep.
And then it also gets into it's so human-like, and they're even trying to develop more consciousness-related things.
Yeah.
I mean, it's depressing. I mean, I'm not sure how to even.
It is depressing. I mean, this is to me, this is actually one of the most momentous technological developments, I think, in human history, in terms of a technology, because it really challenges us to redefine our role in the world. And I don't know, we'll have to see what comes out. I mean, hopefully Mashiach will come before all of these issues have to be addressed. But there's a lot that's going to have to be addressed here. This is really changing. This is a real game changer in terms of the world. This is not just a nice a new app that came out on the market. Okay, got to stop here. Anyway, be well. Have a good Shabbos.